Welcome to the Journal European Economic Association and Foundation BBVA Lecture Series, which has now become a noted entry in the academic calendar of keynote lectures. Each year, the lecture is first delivered in January at the ASSA meetings, and then in May at the BBVA headquarters here in Madrid. So let me take the opportunity to thank the Fundación BBVA for hosting this event this evening. The lecture actually will be published as a lead article in an issue of JEA in the next year. Let me just spend a few words about the journal. The JEA was established in 2003 with the goal of becoming a top-tier general interest publication in economics. We welcome submissions from all fields, including macroeconomics, economic theory, applied macro, and applied econometrics. JEA is well on the way to achieving this goal with an influential score close to the level of some top 5 journals, with rising submission across fields and from all over the board. I'm proud, actually, of being part of an editorial board made up of very best economists from around the world, ably assisted with an editorial team at the journal. I would like to take the opportunity to remind you that these talks are addressed to a general interest audience, and the lectures are given from all fields of economics. Our speaker is the Eeckhout and Barcelona School of Economics research professor and CREIT associate researcher, Jan Eeckhout. Among other positions, Jan is fellow of the European Economics Association and also fellow of Econometric Society. Since his PhD from the London School of Economics in 1998, Jan has published numerous influential papers and is a serial winner of the prestigious European Research Council research grants. His research interests range from macroeconomics to economic theory. Jan made notable contributions in the study of labor markets, including unemployment, labor market risk, skill diversity, inequality in cities, and the macroeconomic implication of market power. Last year, the Princeton University Press printed Jan's first solo book entitled The Profit Paradox: How Thriving Firms Threaten the Future of Work, which is achieving great attention among economists and the media. I'm delighted to be able to present our lecture today, the title of which is What Drives Wage Stagnation, Monopsony or Monopoly? Jan, the floor is yours for the next 40-45 minutes, and all questions will be addressed at the end of the talk.
Thank you, Nicola, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Fundación BBVA, for hosting this wonderful lecture. I'm going to talk today about monopsony or monopoly, or both. This is based on joint work with Shubdeep Deb, Asim Patel, and Larry Warren. And I have to make a usual disclaimer because we use Census data, which is here on the slide. I'd like to introduce the topic to think a little bit about, market power in general, what has happened to market power, and in a sense also a little bit of kind of the dichotomous outcome. Market power means that firms are dominant in their markets, that they do well, but at the same time we see also a number of consequences. And I'd like to do that in kind of with an example that, some time ago, in fact just before the start of the pandemic, I met with a friend of mine. This was in the United States, and we hadn't seen each other. We meet in a bar, and I asked him how are things going after we first greeted, and he said actually not so good. He had started a startup in Silicon Valley, a tech startup, but the startup had failed, and he had decided after many years trying that he was moving back to Europe. He was a European. He's now back in Europe. And as we're actually talking, we see on the television screens that all these bars have. We see the news report of the Dow Jones reaching new highs, and then there's the news anchor saying, then it was, by the way, 25,000, we're quite a bit higher now, saying this is great news, the economy is doing very well. And so at the same time, my friend Alex saying, you know, not for me, it's not doing the same to me because my business has failed. And as we're talking, actually, the server at the bar brings us beers and says, she was overhearing what we say, not for me either. I've been working in this bar for more than 15 years, since 2003, and actually my wage hasn't changed, okay? And so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk about some of these issues. I'm going to relate basically one of the things that we've seen, this rise of market power since 1980, and you'll hear the year 1980 kind of more because it's kind of a crucial year. And basically, what is market power? We see here a graph of what has happened since the 50s, really. You know, market power, this is a measure, a markup, how much a firm charges for the good it sells relative to the cost. And until the 1980s, there was some movement, but not much. And from the 1980s, this has been going up substantially. Similar things happened to things like stock market indices. Take the Dow Jones. The Dow Jones was flat until 1980, since the Second World War, grew at a rate less than 1% average per year. And then from 1980 onwards, the Dow Jones has grown in real terms at 7% a year. So that's a measure of market power. Now, market power doesn't come alone. It has actually macroeconomic consequences, and I'm going to talk about that today. But before talking about, you know, the topic today, let me just say that there's a number of macroeconomic consequences that have been linked to market power. One of them is wage stagnation, the topic of today, but also declining business dynamism. Firms, in fact, hire less and promote their workers less or at a lower rate. There's also a rise in inequality, both in wages and in wealth, concentration of wealth. There's fewer startups. The example of my friend Alex, it turns out it's not just his example, it's the example of many more individuals who have small businesses who try to start up. And then there's also a decline in innovation. We see a declining rate of innovation. Now, the research that we do is trying to understand some of this. First of all, what are the causes? And I'm going to talk at the end a little bit more about the causes, but really technology plays an important role. You know, this is the digital age. 1980 is really the year when the digital age starts, and that's really what causes this dominant position of many of these firms, and then also the consequences. But the second thing we really want to do with this research is to understand the mechanism, the economic mechanism. Why is it happening and how is it happening? And this is going to be what I'm going to do today. And today my focus is going to be first on wage stagnation. It's the story of the waiters in the bar whose salary hasn't changed. And you might think, is this really true for everyone? Well, I'm going to show you a graph in a second, but it is. And I'm going to try now and get at the second thing is, what is this economic mechanism? Why is this happening? And here's the fact. Okay, here I have two series. This is a series since the late 40s. One is productivity. By the way, all my data for today is for the United States, and we come back in the discussion for sure talking about Europe. This is productivity, and productivity has been growing at a fairly constant rate since 48. And what we see with wages is, and I should say, this is wages of all production and service workers. This is 90% of the labor force. This excludes managers and supervisors. Okay, and there's a good reason for that, because their wages have gone up like substantially. So what has happened to 90% of the working population? Their wages were going in lockstep with productivity until 1980, and then that stopped. And then their wages were really flat in real terms. That is, adjusted for inflation, there was no change in wages. And I'm going to try and think about what has happened. Okay? And I'm going to explore two mechanisms. As I said, this is the economic mechanism. One is monopsony. This is going back to Joan Robinson, okay, in the 1930s. What she basically suggested is, okay, we know what monopoly is, a dominant firm, but that dominant firm can not only sell its good at a high or too high a price, it can also hire its workers at too low a wage. And Joan Robinson was basically saying that. This is a way to think about the dominant position of a firm in the labor market rather than in the goods market. And that's really the relationship of, think of, you know, maybe a large firm. It could be a copper mine in a mountainous village. The workers have nowhere else to go. This is the big employer. The copper mine can actually pay wages that are lower than what the productivity is of the workers, and that's the direct effect. The second effect, the second mechanism that I'm going to consider is a mechanism which I'm going to denominate monopoly. It's basically market power of the firm in the goods market for what you sell. And that dominant position that market power in the goods market, does it have an effect on wages? And the answer is not directly. This is not Google paying its workers badly. In fact, there's no evidence that Google pays its workers badly. But it is an effect that's coming from Google, Facebook, Inditex, AB InBev, hundreds of firms that are large and dominant. And once this is having a large enough effect on GDP, and these dominant firms have an effect of around 30–40% on GDP, this has macroeconomic consequences. And what is the macroeconomic consequence? Well, if enough firms sell their goods at a price that's above their cost, then basically they sell less of it. They, of course, get higher revenue because they sell fewer units, but at a higher price. That raises their revenue, but they sell fewer units. If you sell fewer units, you produce fewer units. And if you produce fewer units, you need less labor to produce it. And that basically lowers the demand for labor. And because it's macroeconomically sufficiently large, that lowers basically the wages. And this second channel is trying to measure what we call the general equilibrium effect of output market power on the labor market, okay, through this channel of too high prices producing too little demand for labor, too low wages. That's the plan for today. What is our objective? The first thing we want to see is whether with market power we can actually explain this decoupling of wages and productivity. Maybe something else is going on. So the first thing is we want these two things can be actually explained. And then once we do it, then the question is, can we now say how much of this decoupling, this gap between productivity and wages is due to market power in the goods market and how much is due to this monopsony power, this direct effect in the labor market? So I showed you already the evidence on market power. I should decouple it. There's market power again in the goods market. We see that there's evidence markups have gone up since the 1980s. On monopsony power economy-wide, there is not that much evidence. And I'm going to give you at least our evidence based on our data and our method of measuring. And the evidence at the moment is inconclusive in the literature. We're going to add to this inconclusivity because we're actually saying that monopsony power hasn't changed much. There hasn't been much of a change. We call the measure of monopsony power the markdown as opposed to the markup because it's how much less you pay to a worker, how much down you pay the worker relative to their productivity. We're going to find that there's not much of a change in monopsony power in these markdowns. They're there. They're substantial, but they don't change much. Now, there's a bit of a challenge. Part of this is the research is solving these challenges with respect to how do we solve it. There's a long tradition of using concentration measures. You might have heard of HHI. We're going to completely go a different direction because there's difficulties in using HHIs over time, especially over long periods. Okay. I don't want to enter into the debate about why that's problematic, but we're going to leave that aside. By the way, this is still 99% of all court cases are debates about HHI. So in court, they still use that methodology, but I think most academics have concluded that this is something that doesn't help us understand the problem. So our approach is basically estimating a model. I'm going to show you as little as possible about the model. I'm going to show you some, so I'm going to bore you to some extent. But the point is, and I think that the innovation here is that we're going to jointly measure in that structural model, if you want, the markup and the markdown. So we're going to have output market power and input market power, so to speak. And I'm going to estimate also this market structure. I'm going to show you that in a second. So before, if you want to switch off, let me just tell you what the findings are. We find that competition has decreased over time. Okay, this market structure that we measure substantially. Second, this translates in a sharp rise in markups, but not a substantial rise in markdowns. Okay, so it's important to make that distinction because this is going to be important for the conclusions. We can explain with this mechanism this decoupling of the productivity and the wages, these aggregate wages. And given that we can do it, we can also say what percentage is going to come from monopsony, what percentage is going to come from monopoly. I'll give it away already. This is not Hollywood. I don't have to wait until the last minute to give you the... We find that it's predominantly this indirect effect, this equilibrium effect. Monopoly is accounting for most of it. Okay. So let's start. Here's the more boring part. I'm going to have an economy that I'm, basically describing as if the world is very simple. You know that we do that as economists. I'm going to have really a lot of markets. It's a macroeconomy. I have a finite number of firms in each market. So think one market is soft drinks, and I have Coke and Pepsi and Dr. Pepper, which is one market. And then I have another market, which may be furniture stores. And I have the local furniture store, and I have IKEA, and I have other things. And then I have the cars market. And there's many of these different markets, but in each market, there's a few firms only who compete. And then households, we have to say something about this demand. And they have preferences over both consuming everything that's being produced. That means drinking Coke and Pepsi and buying furniture and buying cars. But they also have to work, and they supply labor. So, you know, in the morning they go out to work, at night they consume, so to speak. And so we're going to have them consuming these goods that they have basically other people have produced. And the key thing is that within one market, the difference, my substitutability between Coke and Pepsi is actually very high. I don't care too much about the difference. It's very hard, it's much harder to substitute between markets, you know, a good from soft drinks versus a good from furniture. And that's basically going to give me this less ability to substitute. And I'm going to have this both in the goods market and in the labor market. It's easier for someone who works in a bar to go to another bar and start working there. But it's much harder for this waiter to then say, oh, I want to work in a hospital as a nurse. It will take some training, and there's going to be some adjustment. Okay, and that substitutability also in the supply of your labor is going to be much harder between markets than it is within markets. I have here my standard utility function. And what do firms do? Firms are very simple. They sell a good and they hire workers. That's the only thing they do. Okay, their workers are, of course, all different types of workers. And there is now a small market. So Coke and Pepsi, they compete against each other. And they have market power. If there's only 2 firms, well, they have a lot of market power. If there are 10 firms, they have less market power. If there's 20, 30 firms, then there's even less market power. And so, in a sense, how many competitors you have is going to determine really the extent to which there is competition in this market. And we're going to solve for what is known as a Cournot equilibrium. Okay, I'm nearly done with my equations, but I'm going to show you one more slide. This is something from a very kind of basic textbook model. It says if you have market power, then you don't set your marginal product equal to your marginal cost. You set your marginal product plus some wage, which is basically coming from the ability to overcharge a customer because you have market power. You can charge them more than what they really would. You would be able to charge them if there was competition. And that's basically this 1 plus epsilon. It's the elasticity of the demand. But I have also market power in the labor market. So I'm able to pay them lower wages, and that's the 1 plus epsilon W. I can do that there too. Okay. And this tells me everything there is to know about what's going on in this market. Because it says, on the one hand, I have a way to charge more in what I sell, and on the other hand, I have a way to pay less in what I hire to produce these goods. And ultimately, what I'm after is this, 1 plus epsilon P and this 1 plus epsilon W. We call the markup and the markdown. Okay. There's a formula for them. It's an ugly one. I just put it there for completeness. Okay. But the way you want to think of this is if you're a dominant firm, this mu is going to be large and this delta is going to be large. If you're a small firm, this mu is going to be small and this delta is going to be small. That's the best way to think about this. Okay, let me go to what we do quantitatively when we really look at the data. I should say this is using a large amount of data. In fact, we look at the tradable sectors as explanation for it, but we look at all firms because we have the United States Census of all firms. Okay, so this is really very detailed data, and every firm is included in there. Firms by law are forced to respond to the census. And so we know a lot of information about the census. That's also why I had to make this disclaimer. It's very hard to actually show results unless they haven't been cleared by the US Census, because they're very careful in protecting the privacy of these firms. And what do we observe in this data? We observe in this data how many workers each firm has. We observe what they pay in wages to these workers. We observe how much revenue they create. We observe in what sector they are. We observe, whether they're in soft drinks or furniture. These things we all observe. And what are we going to do? We're going to do an estimation. What is our estimation? Well, we're going to do 3 steps. And the 3 steps tell us the following, that on the one hand, we see wages and employment. It turns out that, through the lens of this model that I sketched, very superficially, but that I sketched, this allows us to estimate what is called the labor supply function. Why is that important? Because it's important that the steeper that is, the more this firm that has market power can actually lower the wage relative to the productivity. In a competitive market, the labor supply function that a firm faces is flat. And the more market power you have, the steeper that is. And it turns out that the steepness is actually increasing with the dominance of a firm. And what is a dominant firm? A firm that's more productive. The more productive firms are going to be more able to extract the rents both from the workers and from their customers. And so when we see wages and employment, we can estimate this labor supply function. The key parameters are going to be a theta and an eta that is going to determine this markdown. Then we say, okay, we also see employment. Given that we know what this elasticity is, we can actually solve for this big economy, and we can solve for each individual firm what their productivity is. What does that mean, productivity? Well, it means basically how good you are at producing in your market. And if you're better than the other firm, you're going to make more profit, you're going to have a higher market share. So, for example, Amazon is a very high productivity firm in our data. And then once we have that, we can, of course, also calculate what these markups and markdowns are. Because I know for each firm how good they are, and I can then, through the lens of this model, I can then calculate how much each of these firms is going to overcharge for the goods it sells and underpay for the workers it hires. This mu and this delta. And then finally, given that, we solve for what the market structure is because we see the revenue. And basically we back out what market structure here is very simple in this model is the number of competitors. How many firms are competing against each other? Okay, this is just an illustration of how we do that estimation. You see 2 markets, a red market and a blue market, and these red lines and blue lines are basically what we estimate. Okay, there's a lot of machinery behind it, but basically that's where we get this eta and this theta from. That's telling us, these are data points, and basically we use that slope, and the steeper that slope is, of course, the more monopsony power that firm's going to have. We get these estimates. Here they are. Okay, we have to use an instrument because, of course, these error terms here for the technicians in the model are not independent, and so we use taxation. We use the taxation tax differences over time to estimate these elasticities. And these are the 2 elasticities we get. Clearly, we find that within the market, the elasticity of substitution is higher. Coke and Pepsi are closer substitutes, but soft drinks and furniture are not. We use some other values from outside, but this is trying to give you an idea what has happened to firms since 1997 and 2016. By the way, I would love to start in 1980, but the census actually didn't start that early. The census started in 1993, but with very limited data initially. And so from 1997, it's only really starting to have decent data. So our data starts in 97, not in 1980. And so what we see, the difference between 1997 and 2016 is that actually this productivities, we have many more very good firms and many more actually very bad firms, because the red line, this distribution says, how much do you have of each of these firms? And we see that that variance has gone up, has increased. It has also shifted to the right. But the main insight here is that the variance has gone up. And this is going to tell us already something, because you can imagine that, say, retail, what has happened, Amazon has become much more productive than its competitors. And this is something that really is one force behind market power, and we see that in the data here. This is when we estimate the market structure, how many firms there are. Well, in the 97, there was on average 16 firms in each market, and this average has fallen to 4. There's a huge drop in the number of competitors. Okay? And this is going to be one of the drivers behind this rise in the markups and the effect on the markdowns. And here they are. Here are our estimates. I should say I showed you in the beginning some markups, but they were measured completely different with a very different method. Okay, I'm not going to go back, but the magnitudes are not so different. We're in the same ballpark. Okay, that's, to us, was a positive surprise. You know, first of all, you have very different data, you have a different method, you might get something different. They're in a very similar order of magnitude. Here it's going from 97, from around 1.45 to 1.85 roughly. Okay, nearly 1.9. But markdowns don't change. There are markdowns. This is saying that, you know, workers are typically paid 35% below what they're producing. That's the markdown. But it's still only 38% by the end of the period. It's gone up a little bit, but not much. Nothing compared to the rise in the markups. And this is already going to tell us or give us a clue as to, when I come to this decomposition, what is responsible for each of these two channels is responsible for this difference between productivity and wages. Now, when I show you this first, this is an average, but this average is just an average. There's a lot of stuff going on that's very different. Here are the two distributions, by the way, which are not so different from what we see in the data. This is the blue distributions, what happened in 97. The distribution of markups is much more compressed. So firms were more similar and therefore their markups were more similar. And then by 2016, this has spread out completely. That's also true for the markdowns. The thing is, the scale, if you see the scale here, it's a very narrow scale. So, you know, it looks as if there's an increase in the spread, and there is one, but it's really much more compressed than this one. This is going from 1 to 2.5, and before it was only from 1 to 1.5. And that's the important thing here. Here we see the percentiles of these distributions. It's all about this top percentiles, that tail going out, okay, which to a lesser extent happens in the markdowns, because these markdowns are fairly constant. Now here's the decoupling. Here's the decoupling. Look at the solid red line. What is that? That's basically productivity, but now measured with different data than the first graph I showed you, because this is only my census data. Okay, that's the red line. And then the blue line is what has happened to our wages in the census. The dashed lines are other measures, ignore them for now. Okay. But what this is saying is we've seen in the data that there's an increasing gap between productivity and wages. That's also true in the census. We see that the worker productivity has grown much more than what the worker wages have grown. They're not exactly flat, so the census wages go up a little bit, not compared to what we had in the entire economy, but here we have also all the managers, okay, that are included. What does the model predict? The model predicts something surprisingly similar. Look, in terms of the magnitudes, this is a very similar evolution. The model predicts a productivity per worker that's going up. I showed you a little bit that its productivity shift to the right, so you get a higher GDP per worker. And you get a very similar development or evolution of the wages. So basically, the model wages and productivity can explain this decoupling. Notice that this is exclusively driven by three things. One, markups, how much they charge too much for their final goods. Markdowns, how much they pay the workers too little. And then what we call productivity, because that enters into the GDP per worker, which we have backed out and estimated in this model. So the first result, if you want, is that, okay, we can rationalize, explain this gap between productivity and wages over this period 97 to 2016. Okay, that corresponds to what's in the data. Let's now ask, where is this coming from? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take really something very, how should I call it, simple, is that I'm going to think of as if the economy, there's only one type of firm and everything is, you know, kind of what we call representative agent. And then I can do a decomposition. I can look at the GDP per work and the wage, which is the same as I had before. But then I can say, what is the role of the average markup, the average markdown, and then there's something in gray. Why? Because there's something in gray because there's a lot of heterogeneity and things don't add up always nicely if you have very large firms and very small firms. And this residual, as we call it, is basically the kitchen sink for all the rest. And so to get from blue to yellow, I basically have to add markups, markdowns, and this residual. The markdowns and the residual more or less cancel each other out. One is positive, the other one is negative. The markups are the difference between yellow and blue. And it's already telling us, it's giving us a hint that what is driving the rise in this gap. It's a hint because I'm going to do a much more precise exercise. I'm going to play God for a second. God as in, I can be the social planner, okay? And as a social planner, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to say, let me try and pretend that I can make changes to the economy in such a way that I can make things perfect. Perfect as in, there are no markups. There are no markdowns. I can say, let me do as if, because I have this model, I can now solve this model again and say, I'm now going to do this as if there is really no market power whatsoever. What I'm doing then is I'm solving what we call the planner's problem, okay? And then I solve this, I know how much each firm hires, how many workers they hire. You know, they don't really sell them at a price because the planner doesn't set prices, just gives people goods. That's playing God, okay? But I can do more because this is what my first order condition was at the start. And this is what determines everything, how much you pay and how much you charge. Pay your workers and how much you charge for what you sell. And remember that we had these two wedges in there. We had the markup on the one hand and we had the markdown on the other hand. And so being God, what I can do is I can say, you know, let me shut down both of them. Let me solve this as if there's no problem. There's no market power problem. Or, and this is going to be more interesting to do the decomposition, let me just shut down monopsony. So I said this equal to 1, this delta is equal to 1, and I only have output market power. Or, let me play God again and say, let me keep monopsony, let me kill monopoly. And so now I can see what the effect is of each of them. Okay, and that's what I have here. In blue are the wages W star star, where we basically have both market power in the output market and we have monopsony power in the input market. Okay, so we have these two forces at play. Now, what is the green line? The green line is where I say, let me shut down the monopsony. Let me shut down this possibility for firms to to pay wages that are below their productivity. I'm going to pay them their productivity. What would happen to wages? Wages shoot up. Okay, and that's basically what the difference is between the blue and the green line. Fine. Now let me keep monopsony, but let me shut down what happens in the output market. How can I do that? Well, basically, I'm God, I can shut down this markup channel, and that's going to be the red line. It's basically saying how much higher your wages would be if there was no output market power. Okay, and then the dashed line is the sum of the two. Now, if I look at this wage level, about 60% going up to 69% is coming from goods market power, coming from monopoly. And the rest is coming from monopsony, labor market power. So it's saying, okay, in terms of these differences, you know, we have monopsony power, but it's not changing that much. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate not just the wage decomposition, what the level is. I'm going to calculate what the growth of wages is, or said more accurately in what we're looking at here, what the stagnation of wages is. So now, instead of looking just what these wage levels are, let me look at the wage stagnation, the wage growth or stagnation. And this is basically the same graph that I had from the first picture I showed you about this wage stagnation. Here I have my wage, But this is now the wage growth, right? The change in the wage. And let me ask, how much of this wage growth over and above what I have in the competitive market would be due to monopsony power over time? And that's what this green line is. And now how much that is if I don't have monopsony power? Okay, that's how much I would gain. Why? Because, of course, all of these workers would now get a higher wage because there's no longer any monopsony power. Let me do the same thing, but ask how much higher would the wages be if there was no output market power? So the firms cannot charge a price that's higher than their marginal cost. What would the wage be as a result of, remember, this general equilibrium effect on prices and how much they produce and the demand for labor? And we would see a much bigger growth of wages. Okay, and the sum of the two is the dashed line. So now, in terms of the growth, we see that going from 55% to 80%, that's really how much of the growth of wages is due to the fact, or the stagnation, therefore, is due to this goods market power. The stagnation is this difference between the red line and the blue line is really coming mainly from the output market power that these firms have, and not so much from the input market, from monopsony power. And the reason is because markups have increased a lot, markdowns haven't increased much, okay, as we estimate them. And I think that's the main insight that we obtain here. What is my conclusion? I have two more slides. I have a conclusion slide, and then I have a slide to think a little bit about what we can do. But what can I conclude? First of all, I think we have a way to think about these two things that are happening simultaneously, monopoly and monopsony. They're happening at the same time, and both of them we recognize and we find in the data that they have an effect on wages. Monopsony is obvious, there's a direct effect. Monopoly is a little bit more complicated because I need many more firms whose effect has a macroeconomic implication. And the second thing is, in terms of what we do, we back out this market structure. Remember, I said we know how many firms compete. But what are our main facts? Well, first of all, over time, output market power has increased from 1.45 in 1997 to 1.93 in 2016. Okay, so there's a substantial increase in this market power. The markdowns are relatively stable. There's a slight increase, but not much. And that increase is saying, well, first of all, that level says, there is a problem with monopsony power. Firms are not paying their workers their marginal product, so to speak. But that problem is not becoming bigger over time, or at least not much. So we get this decoupling of these wages and productivity. We can explain it. Some people have said maybe it's the decline of the unions. We get all of this through this effect coming from these two channels. And when we decompose them, we find that the dominant force is this monopoly force, which accounts for between 69% in levels and 80% in terms of the wage stagnation. So 80% by the end of all this wage stagnation is actually due to the fact that these firms are charging too high a price for what they sell. Still 20% is due of the growth is due to the fact that they have monopsony power. That's our main conclusion of this decomposition. But let me now take to conclude finally one step back and ask what can we do? What are the policy implications of this? Because remember, we've been looking at the implications directly on wages, but remember there's also these implications on these startups. My friend Alex, whose startup business doesn't get successful, we see in the data this is much more widely spread than just for this one individual I know. It's really statistically very significant, the decline in startups, for example. So there's many broader implications. So first thing we can ask is, what can we do with taxes? And the answer is, we can do something. What we can do with taxes is we can redistribute. We take some of the money of Zuckerberg and we give it to someone poor. Okay? That helps. But unfortunately, it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the fact that even if he takes Zuckerberg's wealth away, he's still going to try and do what he's doing now, which is maximize his profits. It's going to be taxed away, but he's still going to have a dominant firm. So he doesn't solve the problem. He doesn't get at the root cause of the problem. And so then we get to antitrust and regulation with one objective. The only objective of antitrust and regulation is to foster more competition, to create more competition between firms in those markets. In the European Commission, the Digital Markets Act has been put forward and voted in the Parliament, which is a way of trying to get exactly at that. Some of these approaches are what is called interoperability. That is, you may have large firms that are dominant because they have scale economies and network effects, but you try to have on this large network maybe different operators who compete, like different railway companies that are on the same rail tracks. So it's a way of creating competition on a large platform. Of course, we've known about regulating utilities for a long time. Electricity is a regulated utility, gas, water. Similar tools are going to be used also to regulate some of these dominant digital firms, for example. But I think what is maybe a more shocking idea is that we can use these policies, we can use the Digital Markets Act, we can use antitrust and regulation, yes, to foster competition, but what is the outcome? Well, the outcome is that if we have more competition, we're going to have higher wages. So you don't even need taxes to redistribute. You don't need taxes to get social policies. You can do it with antitrust and regulation. If you manage to reduce the dominant position of these firms, you get basically outcomes, macroeconomic outcomes, that are way beyond what these firms are selling because they have macroeconomic implications. So it's kind of thinking, and I think it's a not very common way to think about it, but really antitrust has social implications. But there's one tiny, or rather very big problem, which is coming from the fact that we also have these big firms. And in order to attain this regulation, to attain this antitrust enforcement, we need, well, enforcement. We need a political machine that can actually do it. We've had one step, we have the regulation. I bet you what we're going to see in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, we're going to see excessive litigation where all these large firms are going to litigate these new laws. And they're not only going to litigate these new laws because they don't want them to implement them, they're going to do everything to avoid that these laws are implemented. And if they could, they would have tried to not have these laws in place. Why? Because if I'm a firm that has market power, what does market power do? It generates profits. The good thing about profits is I sit on cash. I can use that for lobbying. I can influence the political process. One of them could be I lobby in order to not get regulation. Or I can use it to lobby certain politicians so that they don't propose particular laws. And I can even use it in the execution of the antitrust in the judicial system. But if I have lobbying, for example, that gives me favorable regulation, what that means is favorable regulation, it means that I face less competition as a result of this favorable regulation, because the regulation is not going to restrict my competition. It's going to keep my dominant position. In fact, it might even increase my dominant position. Now, if I have favorable regulation, it gives a more dominant position, I have more market power. But then I can have more profits and I can have more lobbying, and this goes on forever. So I think that what we really need to think about is antitrust and regulation that has a separation of the policy and the politics, i.e. the political process. And we have a precedent. The precedent, I think, is the central bank, where, in the 70s, I argue that it's probably the most successful influence that academic economists have had on policies to propose independent central banks, because they realize that politicians have a strong incentive to inflate the economy just before elections, because it looks very, rather than inflating it, printing money if you want, or have government spending. It looks like there's a lot of economic activity. People are happy, they vote for this politician. Of course, 6 months later, we have inflation. And the good thing about having countries like Argentina and Venezuela, we see it every day how this works. What we've done in most Western economies is, since, let's say, the 90s, 80s, and 90s, we've decided we have to take that power out of the politician's hand. They can still put the independent governor or president of the central bank in place, but they cannot set the policy. And that governor is going to be in place for 5 or 6 years, and then elections don't play a role in this anymore. You can't get rid of your governor of the central bank. And with one clear mandate, 2% inflation. Now, if you can do something similar for antitrust, for regulation, where we basically have this separation between the politics and the policy, I think there's hope that we can get an enforcement of competition or pro-competitive policies that are ultimately going to be beneficial to, well, the majority of the agents in the economy, both firms, workers, startups, you name it, where all these effects are. Let me conclude here. I'm sure, and this is my last point, there's going to be questions, what about Europe? Let me just say Europe is fairly similar, but we can leave that to the discussion. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for your attention.